and I have to also admit that I ripped this completely off of somebody named Nancy Barron, who does ocean science communications, and with her permission, of course. And so this is what she developed as the science communications ecosystem. And it's just to kind of break it down really quickly, you know, it's basically how science becomes policy, and the idea is that when it becomes policy, it then goes back and feeds back into the system again of science. And it has all of these elements that are important, you know, all the research-based elements are important. And then what you'll see here is this little circle, communicate and connect, and not everybody pays a lot of attention to that. I think in the scientific process, quite often that's the one that is thought of last. It's not always built into the process unless it's publishing in a research publication. But I would argue that in order to reach those audiences that are going to affect policy change, that you have to do more than just publish in a journal. You need to do much more active types of science communication, which is what we're talking about here. And so what happens when you forget about this, the communicate and connect? What happens to that ecosystem? Well, I think a lot of this happens. And suddenly you go from a very rich and vibrant ecosystem to one where you actually have the science happening in one side, and you have this void to policy change. And I think in Canada we've seen, you know, recently, we can go back in the last 10 years and see that that kind of ecosystem was there to a large extent. There was a lot of muzzling of scientists, there wasn't a lot of communication, there was a lot of mistrust between government and science, and what we ended up with was this kind of barren wasteland. Thankfully that's changing. So why do we need the evidence, and why do we need the policy? Well, the policy helps to support science in many ways. It obviously puts money into your research projects. It stimulates jobs. There's the whole innovation agenda, which is super important to the government. It facilitates trust in the scientific process, and I think that's a really key piece as well. Increases public awareness, and of course, then it has obvious benefits for health and society. So this is it's a really old publication, and I'm bringing this up because there is a lot of people who do research on the impact of science communication and science articles like written in the New York Times, for example, on science as a whole. And so this goes back, I think this is 1991, and this study looked at citations. So this is looking at how this affects your science and your reputation as a scientist specifically. So over a 10-year process, or 10-year span, they looked at a number of articles where a research paper had been picked up and covered in a New York Times article. And over that 10-year span, so what you see, the tall black bar is the ones that got coverage, and the ones that did not get coverage in the New York Times are represented by the pink bars. And so overall, every time a paper gets covered in a mainstream journal or a mainstream newspaper like the New York Times, the citation rate for that paper actually has a measurable increase associated with its coverage in the newspaper. And so this is old. And but more recently, we have other ways of measuring, and there's again tons and tons of stuff out there that talk about how publications, how social media, how articles in newspapers affect not just your citation, but other things as well. And so are you familiar with Altmetrics? Everybody's kind of familiar with Altmetrics, measuring alternative sources of impact that are not just citation-based or publications in journals. And so a lot of this is still ongoing. I found this one from 2013. I know there's got to be more recent stuff. I did try to take a look for something really good that was recent, like in the last year, but I couldn't find anything really great. I'm sure it's out there. But they've done a lot of work looking at Twitter. Twitter, I think, has had a lot of attention on it in terms of, you know, how is it having an impact on science. And I think they've pretty much demonstrated now that Twitter does also have a positive association with citations, as here this study looked at Facebook wall posts, blog mentions, mainstream media, and forum posts, and all of them they found to have there was a positive association between use of that media and citations. Not enough evidence for LinkedIn, Pinterest, Google+, and Instagram. They pointed out Google Plus as actually having a negative association. I'm not really sure why that is, but this might be why nobody uses Google Plus. Instagram, and we can have a whole conversation about that. I'm not sure if Mel will talk about a little bit about that because it's more recent. I would love to see something on Instagram because I do think that it's becoming more of a platform that people are using. I still think Twitter is number one with scientists, and I think I looked at it as like something like 5 years ago, there was only like 2.5% of scientists that were actually using it, and that number is up over 20% now, so it's definitely increasing the number of scientists that are using it, and connecting with media directly. I've seen that happening too. All right. And then I'm just going to finish off here with this last slide looking at social media because I'm going to hand that over to Mel in a few minutes. But the interesting thing that I want to point out here about social media as opposed to getting, doing that interview and getting something written up in the Globe and Mail or the New York Times is that this is actually facilitating conversation. This is not one-way directional. This is not you saying something and it get put out there for somebody to passively take in. More and more you can actually engage with those audiences directly via these means. And that actually opens up a lot of different opportunities for you as scientists to learn more about what people are thinking about, what's resonating with them. How can you get into those niche audiences, for example? How can you help spread your research through those channels? And so the last point there is that overall, and this kind of gets back to this idea of, what are you sharing? Through social media and everything I've looked at with regard to this is that if it's lay language, if it's digital media, if it's done in the types of things that you guys were working on this morning, as opposed to just, the title of the journal or whatever, it's going to have way greater pickup and impact talking in lay language, shorter bits, rather than the long stuff. So I'll stop there because I know we're going to cover this in a little more detail in a bit.